Hello, my name is Russell Swanson, and this is a lecture in my series of lectures on the history of ethics. And today I'd like to talk to you about some of the legacies and critiques of Kantian ethics. In my 15th lecture, I discussed Kant's theory of morality, and now I'd like to discuss some of the implications of his attempt to offer us a persuasive account of absolute moral truth. However, I'd like to offer you a little bit more complex lecture today, something almost like a trilogy, something in 3 parts. This is getting later in the lecture series. It's kind of later in my course in ethics, and I often like to sort of ramp up the intellectual expectations by this phase of the course. I'm also going to borrow this sort of 3-part structure from one of the giants whose shoulders I stand upon, and that's the American philosopher James Rachel's in his work, The Elements of Moral Philosophy, which I used in the 90s to teach from for years. And so I really kind of internalized some of his arguments on this point. But again, it's been about 20 years and I've kind of made it my own since then. But I do want to recognize that debt in terms of structure and many of the points within this lecture. And again, so there'll be kind of 3 parts to what I want to do today. In general, I want to talk about absolutism in ethics, which I will characterize somewhat simply as the idea that there is an absolute moral truth to be had about how to be a good person with regard to at least some of our moral duties. Kant in the 18th century offered a uniquely modern defense of absolutism. What I mean by that is that Kant was very much aware of what I've called in my lecture series the modern crisis in ethics, sort of the implausibility of appealing to scripture or natural moral law in more sophisticated debates about morality in the modern era. And so Kant tried boldly in his way to offer us a kind of a very different foundation for the reality of morality. However, I want to do this by sort of sandwiching a focus on Kant with a sort of a first movement which will focus on a 20th century applied ethical issue involving the dropping of the atomic bombs at the end of World War II in Japan. And what that'll do is, generally speaking, allow us to sort of compare and contrast an absolutist ethical perspective. In this case, it'll be based in religious faith, with something that looks more like another modern theory that we're going to be getting to shortly in this series called utilitarianism, where we weigh the foreseeable and likely outcomes of our actions in order to decide right from wrong. And this exploration of the dropping of the atomic bombs will allow us to sort of juxtapose the theory that we'll be looking at soon called utilitarianism, that kind of consequences-based or consequentialistic theory of morality, with the kind of absolutist approach to morality that is typically, historically, most commonly associated with a religious justification, but is also connected to Kant's theory of morality. Then I will, after I explore this contemporary moral issue or this 20th century moral debate over the dropping of the bombs, I will return for a moment to kind of review and reintroduce and get back on the table the Kantian justification for his thoughts on absolute moral duties. And then I will take that debate over his theoretical framework back into the 20th century again, and focusing there on the work of Elizabeth Anscombe, who was a philosopher at Oxford University in the 20th century, very famous 20th century moral theorist, and perhaps recognizably in this lecture series, our first female philosopher that we're focusing on in this series. And I just want to sort of call that out for what it is. I hope you've listened to me in this lecture series, or if you have listened to me in this lecture series, you'll have the very strong suspicion that I'm not talking about a bunch of dead white guys because I'm a sexist and because I'm a racist and because I'm a classist. Many of these dead white guys of intellectual history happen to come from privilege as well. Rather, in some sense, I like to call it out very explicitly. We talk about a lot of dead rich white guys when we do intellectual history because of the racist, sexist, and classist lenses of societies historically, and particularly over the last couple thousand years. And so it's the 20th century before we get to a major figure like Elizabeth Anscombe, who's really going to sort of rise to the level of influence of the thinkers that we have talked about so far in the tradition. And that's really no accident, right? If you think about it, although Anscombe's working in Great Britain or in England more specifically, you know, it's going to be the 20th century that's going to be finally the century that gives women the right to vote, and that sees the transformation of societal structures and moral beliefs within cultures that treat women as other than property, right? So that's so recent that this is what accounts for the way in which women have been excluded from the debate. And that's not to say that there haven't been incredible female intellectuals all along, but given the way that they were systematically excluded from the academic debates and from being taken seriously, you know, folks like Mary Wollstonecraft at the end of the 18th century had to fight and claw their way in to being considered or taken seriously. And even then, they were openly mocked in the rebuttals that men often offered to their work. And it's going to take, you know, from the end of the 18th century, you know, like what, 150 so years of active debate before women are going to be allowed into these institutions and allowed into these conferences and allowed into these journals and be taken seriously enough to really begin to influence for the better. I would suggest, obviously, that we left half the minds of humanity into the debate. Elizabeth Anscombe is going to be a figure who shows up prominently in this sort of first movement of this three-part lecture, and then figures very prominently in the third movement of this three-part lecture in terms of the critique of Kantian absolutism. And I think that that's particularly of note because, you know, as much as Anscombe is somewhat of a controversial figure herself within philosophy, she, I think, exhibits a tremendous amount of intellectual integrity, and I will try to explain that as I develop these three parts of the lecture today. Okay, so let me dive into the first part here when I develop for you, again, something that was going to be familiar to many of you, a kind of a context for understanding the decisions and the actions of the US to drop not one but two bombs in 1945 on Japan. Okay, let's set this up a little bit. In April of 1945, the war was entering its fourth year. It's hard to imagine, you know, it seems like our contemporary wars in Afghanistan and Iraq have gone on, you know, well past twice as long as that, past that. But World War II was, you know, an incredibly globalized phenomenon in terms of the number of nation states involved and the millions of lives lost and the destruction that was wrought. And really, you know, let's drop back even before April of 1945. Let's drop back to December of 1941. You know, what really, I think, you know, you can make a very strong case. What really got the United States into the move into World War II was not so much concerns about the obvious human rights violations that were going on. I mean, we sort of infamously turned boatloads of immigrants away from our shores, despite having very good intelligence by the 1941 timeframe that there was already genocide going on and ethnic cleansing going on in parts of Europe after the German invasion of Poland, etc. And it's not until the Japanese surprise attack on Pearl Harbor that the United States gets pulled into the conflict. And again, let's develop that a little because I think it's relevant. Japan seems to have made a calculation that the US may eventually be pulled into this conflict. And so before the US got pulled in eventually to this conflict, because the Axis powers were trying to quite literally take a great share of global control, and the Japanese roles in this were largely in the controlling of the shipping channels throughout the Pacific. And so that they knew that if the U.S. ever got involved, the U.S. Pacific Fleet would be a major sort of threat to what they were trying to accomplish and establish in the Pacific. And so before the U.S. got involved and before anyone declared war on the U.S., the Japanese engaged in what is, by the rules of war, an immoral and an illegal attack on Pearl Harbor, where thousands of Americans died and a major blow was dealt to the U.S. Pacific Fleet. I think that's going to be important because that attack is going to give the U.S. a kind of an attitude towards Japan as a foe that's going to influence, I think, later decisions in the war. I don't want to be overly simple about this. This is all incredibly complex, and should consult historians whose expertise is in this area if you're interested in this history. But I think it's fair to say that the fact that that day, which would live in infamy, in December 7th, 1941, is going to color a lot of the U.S. action towards its own segments of its own population, in terms of Japanese Americans who'd actually been born in the United States but had Japanese heritage, and also in terms of the way it conducted the war right up until the end of the war in the Pacific in 1945. So let's fast forward to April 1945, which, it always sort of surprises me to say this out loud. The sitting U.S. president died in April of 1945, FDR, and his vice president, Harry Truman, took over in April. What he inherited there at the end in April of 1945 were mop-up operations in Germany, and victory in Europe would be declared within a month or so, within May. By May, I think, of 1945, Hitler, would commit suicide in his bunker less than 3 weeks after Truman becomes president. So there's not a lot of major decisions for Truman to make with regard to how to proceed militarily in the European theater. However, in the Pacific theater, things were far from over in April of 1945. And so, with that said, what had happened in the early parts and the middle of 1945 was that the U.S. Navy and Marines in particular had succeeded in really turning the tide of the war in the Pacific, and we were slowly pushing Japanese forces off of the islands in the Pacific that they were using to control those shipping channels, those oil shipping channels and shipping channels generally in the Pacific. But of course, at great cost, right? Some of the most famous battles of the war were fought there, and the Japanese were sort of notorious for their military code in terms of fighting to the last person. And so, what was being developed in the summer of 1945 was a plan, I think it was called Operation Downfall, which would be, a gigantic operation to invade the island nation of Japan in order to subdue it entirely. Now, there's a little more context here. There's a really active debate almost to this day amongst historians globally about to what extent the Japanese were already, perhaps by the summer of 1945, willing to engage in some form of conditional surrender. There's reasons against that, and there's reasons to believe that that was likely. By this time, the Russians had broken their non-aggression pact with the Japanese and had begun to invade Japanese-controlled Manchuria. So many in the Japanese military leadership realized that their days were numbered. They were simply running out of blood and treasure. Of course, the United States was also, in many respects, running out of blood and treasure. But keep in mind, right, that one of the reasons for the success of the U.S. was that besides the attack in Pearl Harbor, we had not had our industrial base in our homeland bombed to smithereens, which was true of all the Axis powers by this time, including Japan. heavy conventional and firebombing campaigns had been launched on the island nation of Japan by the summer of 1945. I believe like literally hundreds of thousands of people were killed. I think maybe more people were killed by conventional bombs and firebombs in Japan than were ever later killed by the 2 atomic bombs. Some people would say that the firebombing that we engaged in Japan would have been a war crime had we lost the war. Of course, keep in mind that those campaigns on cities, particularly using incendiary bombs and largely wood-dominated architectural cities in Japan, while potentially treated as war crimes if we'd lost, this was in retaliation for what Axis powers had been doing. What I forget the date for this, but what FDR had called, maybe even in the late 30s, inhuman or inhumane barbarism on the part specifically of the Germans to engage in systematic bombing of cities as they did in say, Great Britain or England specifically. This was just not done if you wanted to call yourself the good guys in the conduct of war. When civilizations or nation states go to war, this dates all the way back to Aquinas in the 13th century. There's a body of literature, a body of thinking that's often referred to as the just war theory, which says, one of the #1 rules in war, if you want to conduct it within any semblance of a moral framework, is the principle of discrimination, which is that knowingly you target combatants and you don't target non-combatants on purpose. Of course, let's say it out loud that in war, which is, hell, non-combatants always die. But in terms of moral appraisals of how nation states conduct wars, and this is to this day, right, like a crucial moral distinction. If you target non-combatants on purpose, now we call that terrorism, right? So, keep that in mind in terms of the development of the context for this debate. The knowing, conscious targeting of non-combatants, it crosses a moral line that's been established for centuries in the conduct of war. And we'd already condemned the Axis powers for doing that, Japan and Germany in particular. But we also seem to, and I say we in the United States, I can only really speak to our practices or conduct in the war. We had been firebombing cities like Dresden in Germany and cities like Tokyo in Japan. And in some sense, you can say, I think with some justification, that you were targeting factories and that you were targeting, again, industry in such a way that the United States was fortunate enough to not have that bombed out, and that this is going to play a role in the way that we sort of outlasted and outcompeted the Japanese military in the Pacific and turned the tide. But with that said, we'd bombed Japan so significantly for so long that that many of the best targets in terms of the militarily valuable targets had been hit, perhaps multiple times by this time. But what had happened, again, in the larger context by the summer of '95, right, is that we'd been bombing Japan, softening it up for Operation Downfall, this possible invasion. We had turned the tide in the Pacific with major naval battles and major, island battles, and really begun systematically pushing the Japanese back to within the boundaries of their own nation. And so in many respects, the opinion of many analysts, both inside and outside of Japan, militarily, the outcome was clear. The question was how it was going to unfold. There was an active debate, it would seem, within Japan. And again, that's led to this historical debate about whether or not the Japanese were willing to surrender. If that's true at all, it was conditional. They had a kind of a religious reverence for their emperor. They didn't want the emperor deposed. They didn't probably want to be tried for war crimes, which they could have anticipated that they would be tried for should they when they eventually lose the war. And so there was maybe some deal making, maybe not some deal making already going on. But in the US, in some sense, the attitude had become so kind of, well, it was very, in many ways, racially charged, at the time, so much so that we were clearly violating the civil liberties of people born in the United States because of their ethnic heritage. And that, I think, as I said before, colors the conduct of the way we conducted the war and military operations in trying to push Japan towards an unconditional surrender. And again, maybe charitably, this was about, you tried to take over the world and you don't deserve a conditional surrender. I think, again, Pearl Harbor comes to mind. You'd pulled the U.S. into the war with this immoral, illegal surprise attack that had been disastrously effective in terms of military goals on the part of Japan. And so this is what Truman inherits in April of 1945. Now, again, let's add one more irony to this, right? Like the Germans had been working on nuclear power in the late 1930s, but because of their own ethnic cleansing, many top scientific minds of Europe, ended up trying to flee Europe and ended up in places like the United States, some of them specifically working on the US, Manhattan Project to operationalize nuclear power or atomic power in the form of a weapon. And that's going to, that's going to be kind of a good news thing that the Germans never completed, their atomic weapons prior to their decision to sort of implement their plans to take over the world, right? Things might have been very different had they conducted that a little differently. And so the US is going to win the race to operationalizing atomic power in the form of a bomb. Now, again, a little bit of debate about how many bombs did we have. I lean towards the 2 to 3 theory. I think that's reasonable. Again, dig into the history on this if you'd like. But this is what Truman inherits, is a decision about operational downfall, which would potentially take a year or more to complete in terms of forcing an absolute and final surrender on the part of the Japanese. The United States, despite the fact that it alone of all the participants in the war had not had its industrial base and its homeland bombed to smithereens, was running out of blood and treasure by 1945, and was, there were some concerns about how long we could effectively continue with the strategies that we had under consideration at the time. So look, there was a lot of uncertainty around the idea of the invasion. And let's add, right, that in the planning and thinking about the invasion, the casualty numbers projected from an invasion of mainland Japan, were upwards of 1 million. And of course, that's going to involve Ally forces. It's going to involve Japanese military and Japanese civilians, right? Because again, non-combatants always die in war, even when you're trying your best to only target, through the principle of discrimination, combatants. So Truman is also offered, right, this other alternative, which is we've got at least 2 bombs ready. And, we know where this story's going. This is one of those stories where you know how it turns out. But what I've tried to do, right, is to develop for you a little bit of an appreciation as to why this is a kind of a moral debate, right? I mean, in some sense, the narrative is particularly within United States history and how it's often taught is kind of black and white. They started it and we finished it, and that we were, clearly, the white hat wearing, saviors of the world. Look, war is always messier than that. And I'm not trying to be a hater when I say that, war is always messier than that. It's just, it just is, the more you look at the conduct of war, even on the parts of the societies that seem to sort of have morality on their side and justice on their side and did not start the wars, but did end up finishing the wars. It's always a little bit more morally gray than we might imagine or what might want it to be. And I think that the dropping and use of the bombs is that. And I'm not trying to say they were obviously wrong, but what I'm trying to say is that it's maybe messier than we've been led to believe or that we've ever maybe thought about, right? And this is part of what I'm up to in encouraging people to think more carefully about questions like what makes us good people and to do ethics, right, is to enter the gray area and to see the subtleties so that you can become more sophisticated and informed thinkers, again, along the lines of the general goal here is that my leap of faith is that if more of us, if we could democratize this practice, this Socratic quest of asking the right questions and thinking through the difficult possible scenarios and answers, then we would lift the level of morality in our own societies, and we would perhaps even uplift the experiment of democracy itself. Again, that might be bold on my part, but that's something that I'm committed to in the work that I do, as bold as that may seem. And so here I'm inviting you specifically to consider, you know, the complexities of the dropping of the bombs in 1945. Now, again, we know what Truman did. He went with, he went with the recommendations of certain members of his staff, I think, over the objections or the concerns raised by the likes of General Eisenhower. The Secretary of Defense at the time, I think, was also considering it problematic to drop these bombs. And, you know, we're the only nation in history to use these bombs. And let's just talk about why. You know, when technology, you know, especially in the 20th century, you know, reached a certain level, the level of destruction that war began to bring was just had never been seen before. And the atomic bombs take that to another level. Of course, these bombs we're talking about, I believe, are like 1,000 times less powerful than the warheads that we have in the ground and in submarines pointed at each other all over the planet right now in this moment, right? But yet, just when you get to the level of atomic bombs, you know, you can no longer say that you're targeting a factory. You can no longer say that you're targeting a military base. These are city-destroying bombs. You know, when the bomb went off in Hiroshima, you know, most estimates say that maybe around 80,000 people died from that single bomb. And that's really just sort of in the short term, because tens of thousands of people would die in the aftermath of that from their injuries, from radiation, right? You know, so we maybe just round number, we're talking 100,000 people from a single bomb. And let's be clear here. You know, you can argue what you want about what was present in Hiroshima in terms of why it was chosen as a target, but with a weapon of this magnitude, it really blurs the line in terms of the principle of discrimination and just war theory. If you want to be the good guys, right, the use of this level of weaponry becomes morally problematic. Now, supposedly, Truman says, and I'll try to defend him as I also perhaps call him out on this, it's reported that he said that he didn't lose any sleep over this decision. Now, that would be a very callous thing to say if we're talking about the death. And again, that was just one bomb in Hiroshima, let's say 100,000 people. You could easily say you get roughly 100,000 people in Nagasaki as well. So we're talking hundreds of thousands of people killed by two bombs, which he ordered and dropped just days apart. And now, again, in retrospect, we think, well, it was effective, right? Because in retrospect, we know that the Japanese did unconditionally surrender just 6 days after the Nagasaki bomb. But I want you to also consider that the kind of logic that Truman was using to make that decision, on the one hand, has a clear kind of commander-in-chief component. All casualties would be on the enemy's side. But with that said, most casualties would be non-combatants. Almost, and again, I don't have the numbers on the top of my head, but almost all. I mean, if you're blowing up a city, you're blowing up people that had absolutely nothing to do with the actual conduct of military operations for Japan. We had convinced ourselves, in a very racially charged 1940s way, that all Japanese were somehow, maybe not worthy of consideration as people, and that they were all somehow supporting, their military. It was true that the Japanese were forcing civilians to train for invasion. And, it's also true to give us our due that we dropped pamphlets, warning of some massive devastation. But again, the world had never seen a weapon of this kind, right? Most people didn't know it existed, right? And so Truman dropped the bomb, and the war was over. And, when he said that he didn't lose a wink of sleep over that, to be charitable to Truman, there wasn't just a commander-in-chief kind of calculus at work here. There was also, kind of even a moral logic at work here. Now, again, I've laid out for you just war theory's idea of the principle of discrimination, but let's go ahead and foreshadow the work we're going to do in the next couple of lectures in this series on the idea of what's called utilitarianism, which is a theory built on looking at the foreseeable or likely consequences of actions in order to decide right from wrong. And let's look at how we could very much use this lens to understand Truman's own even moral logic beyond his decision as commander-in-chief. And that is, look, if Operation Downfall, the invasion of Japan, might cost 1 million lives, let's lowball it and say 700, 800,000 lives, and has this uncertainty connected to it in terms of accomplishing our outcome. Truman was considering the possibility that he could drop these bombs, which were dropped in August of 1945, and have the war over within weeks with no more US casualties. And again, projections, I think, were somewhat lowball in terms of deaths and casualties from the bombs. I think maybe to a certain extent, we didn't even fully understand the consequences in terms of radiation. But, we really unleashed, in some sense, that Godzilla-like monster of radiation onto the world through this decision. But even if we don't lowball the numbers, even if we charitably sort of inflate the numbers for the purpose of this kind of utilitarian calculation, let's say we knew we'd kill 250,000 people, mostly civilians. Well, contrast that with 1 million people dead and 2 years more of war instead of weeks more of war, and maybe greater levels of uncertainty about the outcome in terms of conditional versus unconditional surrender, and how long it would take to achieve that, and would we have the blood and treasure to pursue that? So for Truman, I didn't lose a wink of sleep over that, probably comes from this kind of calculus, as we'll call it, when we look at the work of Jeremy Bentham. This calculus about the consequences, that it seemed obvious that 200,000 or 250,000 was preferable to 1 million. The lesser of two evils, sometimes we call that. And again, it's in contrast with, and this is going to tie back into this lecture in just a moment here, the largely Catholic ethical and moral tradition of what's called just war theory, again, going all the way back to the Catholic theologian Aquinas in the 13th century. So now let's fast forward and go forward to about 1956, I think it was, where Truman, no longer president of the United States, but being offered an honorary degree at Oxford University, I believe, in 1956, as sort of a symbolic gesture on the part of England to recognize the debt to the US, despite the fact that, we broke at some point in a military conflict with each other. The US and England have ironically been incredibly strong allies for much of the time since the break with Great Britain in the American Revolution. So, you know, the English were going to honor the former president with an honorary degree at Oxford as a kind of a symbolic gesture about the American role in maybe quite literally keeping Great Britain from having been invaded by Germany, and for ending the war. Now, at the time, you've got Elizabeth Anscombe working as a young philosopher at Oxford University. I think she'd studied there and ended up working there. And she produced a pamphlet, I believe, I forget the title off the top of my head, but a pamphlet at the time, a writing at the time that was protesting this decision on the part of Oxford to honor Truman with this honorary degree. And her argument, I'll give you kind of the simple version of it, was grounded deeply in her faith. She had, I think, converted to Catholicism as an adult, and she took that personally very seriously. What I'll develop for you later in the lecture is the way in which she was able to sort of separate her professional philosophical work from her personal faith in many regards, famously in her 1958 article, Modern Moral Philosophy. But here in this moment, her position on the honoring of Truman in 1956 seemed to be governed by her faith. And, you know, I'll quote, as did the American philosopher James Rachels in his original article on this letter to the Romans on the part of St. Paul, that, you know, you should not do evil that good may come. And specifically what Elizabeth Anscombe was saying from this Catholic moral tradition was, I cannot be a part, and we should not honor, you know, Harry Truman because he's a murderer. He knowingly took the lives of innocent people in making the decision to drop the bomb. He's a murderer, he's a war criminal. And she used some very powerful rhetoric here that I think is worthy to sort of put out on the table, where she said that, you know, you do not boil a baby alive, a human innocent, right? The choice of baby is purposeful in terms of power of rhetoric, and I think also in terms of innocence, to make that point. You do not knowingly, you know, murder an innocent person, even if by your calculus you think you can save 1,000 other people, and call yourself a good person and be worthy of being honored, right? You're still a murderer. Now, I think it's an interesting moment for some of you who are listening to these lectures to kind of pull out and develop your own intuitions about this. You know, if you feel like her rhetoric is justified, then you're going to have leanings towards absolutism and morality, and you want to think about that as you develop your own ethical position in a more sophisticated way. How do you go about justifying that? To what extent can you employ your justifications for your own belief in absolutism in your moral debates with other people in pluralistic societies, as we discussed in the earlier lecture on divine command theory in this series. But if, on the other hand, you're sympathetic to Truman's position here, then maybe, you know, this idea of weighing the consequences, if that seems, you know, messy and unpleasant, and, you know, who wants to have to make choices like that? But yet, if you are sympathetic to the way in which Truman weighed the consequences, well, not only are you, you know, leaning towards consequentialism, to introduce you to that sort of ethical discourse, that ethical language, you're also, I think, leaning away from absolutism in an important respect. And I'm going to develop that again over the next couple lectures as we talk more about utilitarianism, and specifically talk about the debate over utilitarianism, because it's a very controversial moral theory. At the same time, you know, as being sort of heavily criticized, it's very, very popular. So, you know, here's a positive, right, of taking the time to sort of inhabit these ideas related to this moral dilemma, you know, where you come down here can help you, if you've never engaged in a lot of reflection on your own moral belief system, to pull out, and as I like to say a lot of times, get these ideas out on the table, get these assumptions, these beliefs out on the table, and in some Socratic way allow you to take a closer, you know, sort of critical examination of your own beliefs, decide what to keep and what to throw out. Because if we're honest, a lot of what we already have in terms of our assumptions, we came by fairly passively in the process of our enculturation. So that's an opportunity here. Now, let's go back to Anscombe's rhetoric one moment longer. She says very specifically, you don't boil a baby, I think, to save 1,000 lives. If I recall correctly, she may have even gone on to use that number related maybe to Operation Downfall. I wouldn't put it past her to have made those connections, right? Because she's a brilliant thinker, but she says you don't boil a baby alive to save 1 million people, and that's where maybe, you know, she's even making the direct connection to Operation Downfall and the projected losses there. You know, I can't say that with certainty, but I wouldn't put it past her. Very, very clever person, very well-educated person, and so, you know, it's also to be, as I said before, I'll underline this point because we're going to come back to it. You know, she's using the rhetoric of boiling the baby very much on purpose. You know, there's maybe an element of sophistry involved in the comparison of such a vivid bit of imagery of boiling a baby alive, which is so distasteful and morally repugnant, with the numbers, the abstractions of 1,000 and 1 million. You know, in some ways that really robs the utilitarian line of thinking with some of its power as well. One life versus 1 million lives, when we think of them as concretely as we can, as much as 1 million lives is hard to fathom, you know, we might think about, well, how would they die? You know, she's offering this boiling to death, right? But there's no accident to her choice of boiling to death. If I recall correctly, you know, people who were burned badly, many humans in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, civilians in those cities, were turned to ash in a flash of light. Many others were burned, you know, beyond recognition, and many others were burned just to serious levels that were lethal and obviously lifelong in terms of their injuries if they survived. But apparently some people did jump into water in order to try to mitigate their burns. But if my understanding is correct, that water may have been superheated, and they literally, they killed themselves jumping into what amounted to boiling water. And so in some sense, you know, Elizabeth Anscombe's rhetoric is, you know, both, you know, cleverly selected, but not entirely devoid of, you know, like real connections to life, right? And the history that she's trying to address in that moment, if we're charitable to her arguments there. And again, as I said, her position here, which I sort of foreshadowed with the language of St. Paul, and I think that's what Rachel's was doing when he used that as the quote in the beginning of his chapter from the Elements of Moral Philosophy, you know, that you cannot do evil that good may come. You know, that's an absolutist stance, right? It might be actually interpreted two ways. One way that I'd associate with the thinker and activist and crucial moral figure in United States history of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., you know, it might be that we can take this notion from St. Paul and we can see the connection to how Dr. King tried to conduct his own resistance to racial oppression and subordination and violence in the United States in the 60s, and now, you know, some 50, 60 years later, still present, you know, and sadly, you know, we're kind of confronting the same debates about, you know, how does one respond? And I think Dr. King's answer was that in some sense, you cannot, right, almost a metaphysical claim, achieve peace and positive moral results through negative moral means, right? Like that would be a strong reading of this. There's almost a kind of a metaphysical claim based in faith, that, you just don't, interact with this reality through these, actions of, let's say, killing and violence in order to, you can't achieve peace through, and that would inform the philosophy of nonviolence as a kind of a means of resistance. On the other hand, let's yank that out of the context of the civil rights struggle of the 60s and, talk about, what are you going to do, throw yourself before the Panzer tanks, to resist the German takeover of the world. I mean, at some level, nonviolence as a methodology runs into this kind of more instrumental thinking, which is that the means can justify the ends. However, that leads to the weaker interpretation of the Pauline claim that, that you should not do evil, that good may come. Maybe it's not so much a metaphysical claim. Maybe it's just sort of a divine command theory kind of, that you're not allowed to. You can't be good if you choose to let the ends justify the means. And so whatever interpretation of that, famous line from St. Paul's letter to the Romans, from around, I think, or mid-first century. It seems like Anscombe is utilizing an ethical absolutism, right? And she's aligning herself with that tradition and grounding that in faith in order to resist the honoring of Truman. Now, let's do a kind of a transition here around this big first part of the lecture, and let's transition now back to the 18th century for a moment, and Western philosophy and ethics, and remind ourselves again of what Immanuel Kant was up to when he was trying to develop, as the foundation of the metaphysics of morals, objectivity and rationality. And his idea was that if you ran your personal principles, your maxims, through this thought process generated by the universal law version of the categorical imperative, you'd universalize your maxim and you'd turn your moral dilemma into almost a logic problem. And then what you would discover this way is, a fairly conservative or traditional notion of morality, that thou shalt not kill, and, that you shouldn't commit suicide as a form of killing even, that you ought to engage in charity in certain circumstances, and that you shouldn't party your talents away, and that you shouldn't break your promises, and maybe most famously, that you shouldn't lie. Kant was particularly vehement in his attacks on sort of an instrumental justification of lying, where the ends might justify the means. I mean, if you run lying through his process, you can kind of see where he's coming from here. Consider that your maxim is that you will lie when it serves your purposes. This is very much echoes the promise breaking example that we talked about in the last lecture, but it's worth it to sort of get these thoughts back in our head and put them back out on the table so that we can think about them a little bit more carefully. If you consider that your maxim is that you'll lie when it serves your purposes, and you universalize your maxim, you're going to run into some logical problems here with this world that you're trying to picture, because communication itself, right, is not invented in order to be deceived. It's not engaged in order to be deceived. So to what extent is it rational or logical for you to will? Again, I know people lie, right? Like, that's not the point. This is a thought process that Kant has generated through his universal law version of the categorical imperative to help bring objectivity to our moral dilemmas and to our moral considerations. And as you engage in this thought experiment and you picture a world where you are willing that everyone engage in lying, you are not only undercutting certain personal desires to not be deceived, you're undercutting the nature of communication, or the goals of symbolic interaction themselves, right? And so for this reason, Kant thought that lying was obviously something that universalized produced a contradiction. And because it produces one universalized produces a contradiction, it's immoral, and you have a duty to be honest. Now, Kant was hit even in the late 18th century, by objections to specifically this claim that lying is always immoral, with a kind of a counterexample, counter-argument, where, you know, again, to those of you who are new to philosophical reasoning, you know, we got a position under consideration here, the Kantian justification for absolute moral duties and absolute moral truth. And we've got now the counter-argument through counter-example. Here's a scenario that I'll describe that has come to be known as the case of the inquiring murderer, where we can see that the implications of Kant's defense of an absolute duty to be honest becomes borderline absurd. So it's a counterexample technique, and I would say in some sense almost a reductio technique as well, a reduction to absurdity argument being offered here as well. Now, again, you can figure out where this is going on your own, but I'll flesh it out. You know, I think that the original example was something like this. Imagine that somebody knocks on your door, you know, maybe that's a raving kind of mad person that's got a weapon, maybe a gun, let's say, and this bad person is demanding to know where Marcus is because they're going to kill Marcus. Now, what do you do in that moment? Now, a lot of people want to try to avoid the dilemma here and say, well, I just don't tell them. You know, again, imagine you know, or you have a belief about it, and honesty involves a kind of a genuineness. It doesn't involve correctness, right? It involves a kind of sincerity in your response. That's a subtlety. Let's set it aside for a second. You know, what are you supposed to do when the inquiring murderer knocks on your door? So you can try to avoid it by, you know, I'm not going to say, well, again, imagine the inquiring murderer puts the gun to your head. Well, you know, you could take the bullet for your morals. That seems unlikely. I think to many people, the intuition here is simpler. You lie, right? This is a mad person who's consumed by emotion and anger in this moment and is carrying a lethal weapon. The last thing you want to do is enrage this person further by, you know, getting them angry with you. And the last thing you want to do is tell them exactly where Marcus is, right? And so the right thing to do is to deceive this person in this moment in order to protect yourself and protect Marcus. I mean, that's deep down your motivation here. Okay, so this is the counterexample. It's the case of the inquiring murderer. And Kant actually writes a response to this counterexample, I believe, and I don't have the year that this was constructed as a written response, but I think the title of it was something like "On a Supposed Right to Lie from Altruistic Motives." That would be an English translation of some German title. On a supposed right to lie from altruistic motives. Let's unpack that title. On the idea that it's morally acceptable to lie because you care about somebody like Marcus. And in that work, Kant argues several things. He argues that, one, you're not certain what's going to happen if you tell the truth, and you're not certain if you what's going to happen, you're not certain of, and let me just draw your attention to this, you're not certain of the consequences, right? If you tell the truth, and you're not certain of the consequences if you lie. And so in that case, you know, you got this kind of uncertainty. Now that's Kant in many ways, who is a deontological thinker, a thinker who believes that there are certain actions that are absolutely necessary to do. I'm kind of simplistically using this term absolutism here. Kant believes in absolute moral duties. He's a deontologist for that reason. There are actions that are required of us, and that there are actions that we are required to abstain from if we want to be moral, to the extent that we are moral. And so, again, his project was to defend a kind of clarity about moral duty and what I might say is absolute moral truth about duty. And so he's pointing out that, look, you really aren't sure about the consequences of the actions if you lie or you tell the truth. And so in some sense, you shouldn't take your guidance on right and wrong from this uncertain source. Furthermore, you know, given the theoretical framework that as Kant has put years of his life into developing with incredible detail here, Kant would say, logically, objectively, that you have a good reason to believe that lying is immoral, that you have a duty to avoid lying. And let's add one more thing. If you were to lie, and in order to try to protect Marcus, as I developed that example and added that name in there, what if, unbeknownst to you, you think Marcus is at home, so you lie and you tell this mad person that Marcus has gone to the bus station to leave town. Unbeknownst to you, Marcus is down near the bus station, and the mad person goes to the bus station based on your lie and finds Marcus and kills him. Kant says, now you're involved. You're partly to blame for Marcus's death. So best to just, keep it moral, Kant's going to say, and tell the truth. Now, that's the explicit position of Kant. And I have to say that to a lot of 20th and 21st century thinkers, that's a strange position for such a great mind to have taken. In some sense, I have a thought on as to why that's the case. Why Kant would develop a position that seems to be kind of almost desperate sounding in order to salvage his theoretical framework. Some people would suspect that maybe this is ego. I don't know. I mean, more charitably, I think that Kant would be clever enough to see what's at stake here. Because the moment he begins to admit that there are possible scenarios and circumstances under which we might go against the moral duty to be honest, is the moment that the clarity and truth with a capital T that Kant was seeking to defend with his whole project, the moment that it begins to erode, right? So in some sense, Kant's going to fight as hard as he can, and again, I'm being very, I think, charitable here to Kant, because he must see what's at stake here, and that is the clarity and absolute truth kind of nature of certain moral duties that we have. Now, here's where we get to the third part of this long lecture and complex journey that we've taken today. And we get to the joy of reintroducing Elizabeth Anscombe, because just a couple of years after she's engaged in this pamphlet writing a protest against the honoring of Harry Truman in 1956, she publishes a really groundbreaking, very famous article in a very famous journal, the journal called Philosophy, in 1958, I think in January 1958. In that volume of the journal, she publishes this article called Modern Moral Philosophy. And she does a number of things that are really important, I think, and kind of seminal moments in 20th century ethics there that I'll come back around to. But here, what I want to focus on is the way in which this same person that, based in her faith, objected to honoring Truman, this same person who wants absolutism to be true given her faith-based commitments. As a thinker in the 20th century, I believe Anscombe follows the argument to its logical implication and follows it out in two ways. One, to argue against absolute moral duties in ethics. I'll flesh that out in a second. And specifically, I think really puts a fine point on the critique of Kantian absolutism and the idea of absolute moral duties by really pointing out the place in Kant's thinking where there's something smuggled in to his theoretical framework that is itself unjustified. And that is in the very first step of the three-step process that's generated by the universal law version of the categorical imperative. The first step is identifying your maxim. I tried purposely, right, in some sense, to set up this moment to not point this out to you, and I don't know if you saw it or thought it as we went through it, but what Kant always does when it comes to utilizing his own thought process here, especially with regard to the four famous examples in the Foundations of the Metaphysics of Morals about suicide, about charity, about developing your talents, and about promise breaking as a form of lying. What he does in each of those cases is he considers the action in the most general terms possible. So he's going to consider lying in general, suicide in general, and let's just stick with those two because we can make our point very clearly with these two examples. What Anscombe, as much as her own faith would like her to, for Kant to have been right, what she's going to have the intellectual integrity to do in 1958 is to say, this is the thing that he's smuggling in. Why can't we? What is it about Kant's approach to morality that really prohibits him from distinguishing lying in certain circumstances from lying in other circumstances, suicide in certain circumstances from suicide in other circumstances? Can't we, for example, distinguish between lying in order to make a profit, a greater profit selling your medical goods, when we know that it will cost some lives? Lying in the case of being motivated by profit when you know it's going to cost lives, from lying when, like in the case of the inquiring murderer, when you're trying only to save lives and no one will be harmed by your lie directly. Why can't we run a more contextualized maxim through the Kantian process? What is it about Kant's framework that rules that out? And I think in many respects, this is a kind of I think it's a genius kind of move, right? Because the only thing I believe that keeps Kant from doing that is the recognition that the motivation of his whole project was to defend some absolute moral duties, to defend some version of ethical absolutism. And Kant, as I've argued, I think was clever enough to know that the moment he considers any possible exceptions to a rule against lying, even in the case of the inquiring murderer, is the moment when you take an absolute moral duty and you make it less than absolute. And the moment you make it less than absolute, right, if we can admit now that we have not lived through all possible circumstances of existence, is the moment that we can no longer with clarity explain what is our moral duty with regard to honesty. It's going to be uncertain and unresolved, almost sort of ad infinitum, forever. And so, in this way, what Anscombe pulls off, again, exhibits an incredible amount, I think, of intellectual integrity, because based on her own personal life and her own personal faith and her own thinking within the Catholic theological tradition, and by the way, I think even her husband, Peter Geach, was a very famous figure within that world, intellectual world. There's a sense in which Anscombe is willing to follow the argument and to be honest enough to say this is unjustified even within the framework of Kant's own system. Now, I want to finish this up with a couple of last consideration. One, following Rachel's analysis of this argument. I think Rachel's adds some interesting final considerations here when he looks back at the kind of logic and argument that Kant was using in his defense, right, against the original counterexamples in that writing on a supposed right to lie from altruistic motives. Remember Kant had said you can't be certain about the foreseeable consequences. Well, Rachel's was a utilitarian, so of course he has motivation to argue against this point, and I think he's got a fair one worthy of consideration at least, and that is, well, of course, you're right, Kant, we can't be certain of the consequences, but welcome to life, right? This is not a problem of theoretical frameworks. This is a problem of our existential and epistemological situation, Our epistemic situation is one of imperfect knowledge. And so just because our knowledge is imperfect doesn't relieve us from using our judgment. And when an inquiring murderer knocks on your door, that's a moment that calls for judgment. And as messy as that is, and as we've talked about why Kant would want to dismiss this consideration, Rachel's the utilitarian is going to say, come on, we can't be certain. But many times we can have a good and reasonable or probable judgment about the foreseeable consequences. And depending on the situation, being honest with the well-armed, mad, potential murderer is not the right move to make. We can't be certain of that, but we have to use our judgment based on probability. And the other thing that I think Rachel's points out fairly is that Kant has a kind of a strange inconsistency perhaps in his position, which is ironic given that Kant is building his entire framework around this idea of being purely rational and logical with regard to our moral dilemmas. And the inconsistency is that Kant would seem to hold us culpable, hold us responsible if our lie unintentionally led to Marcus's demise. But he seems to not want to hold us responsible for Marcus's demise if we tell the truth. If we say, oh yeah, I know where Marcus is, I hate to tell you this, and I hope you don't hurt him, but yeah, he lives at such and such an address, and I think he's there. How are you not culpable for what ends up happening when the inquiring murderer shows up at Marcus's place and maybe ends up killing him? That Kant would hold us responsible or partly responsible if we were to lie, but not responsible as if we were to tell the truth, again, betrays a kind of maybe a background set of assumptions that have motivated even Kant's genius work in morality. And I don't know if this is fair. I'm not trying to be uncharitable, but Kant, was raised actually very religiously. I think he did a lot of work that shows he was able to transcend thinking religiously about truth and about morality. He was able to transcend that, I think, in much of his writing. But was there deep down a kind of a motivation to defend absolutism here, and some kind of almost metaphysical sounding claim that you are somehow wiped clean of culpability if you fulfill your moral duty, and yet you are dirtied, you are sullied, you are responsible if you break your moral duty? And the same thing happens. If Marcus gets killed and you're honest, you're wiped clean. But if you tell the lie and that ends up with Marcus being killed, you're somehow culpable. That there's a kind of a almost metaphysical sounding claim going on there that we should be suspicious of in Kant's otherwise modern attempt to defend or create a framework for understanding morality. And ultimately a kind of an inconsistency, Rachel's would say, that I think is worthy of consideration there too. That a lot of life is uncertain, and that if we try to build theoretical frameworks which make morality black and white and somehow discount the gray, that we may, I'm going to borrow a title of a work in a way from a later thinker, Arthur Schopenhauer. I say later, actually, 18th century thinker as well. If I got that right? No, early 19th century thinker Arthur Schopenhauer in terms of his writings. Forgive me, I'm trying to pull something off the cuff here, but Schopenhauer's big famous work is The World as Will, The World as Will and as Idea. And if I play off that a little bit in the way I interpret Schopenhauer's work, when we conceive of the world as it is, as best we can, versus conceive of it through a certain framework or lens, we often get different results. And it seems like in this case, this loose connection I'm making rather ineffectively off the top of my head, Kant is in some ways maybe refusing to see the gray area involved in the human attempt to be moral, because he is strongly motivated to nobly, I think, defend truth you know, to whatever extent he can, a kind of a realism and a kind of an absolutism with regard to moral duty in whatever way he can. That in and of itself, I think, is a noble motivation, but it seems to ultimately maybe color the way in which he wants to avoid the gray areas. And certainly a utilitarian like Rachel's is going to say, you know, when we build our theoretical frameworks, we're going to want to make them a little bit more real world. And so we're going to want to own the way in which judgment and human fallibility plays a part in our moral judgments, and the complexity of life pulls us of necessity into the gray areas. And so I'll finish with this. To a certain extent, you know, while there are Kantians who try to defend the Kantian position to this day, you know, I think one of my professors in graduate school called herself a Kantian. There are not, to my mind, any novel defenses of moral absolutism. I mean, if other than, you know, scriptural defenses and natural law type defenses and Kantian type defenses, what we're going to see after this critique of Kant by the middle of the 20th century is I think largely true of the discourse in ethics, a kind of a movement away from what Kant was trying to defend in absolute moral duties, and this movement towards a recognition of the messiness of ethics. But again, remember, a recognition of the messiness and difficulty of making that moral judgments in the world shouldn't compel us to collapse all the way to a kind of rather unhelpful relativism. We still need to sort of fight the good fight, you know, fight la lucha in some sense, if I borrow something from another context as well, and pull it into this one that I think is related. You know, the struggle for morality continues, right? It hasn't gone away. We still need to try to figure out what it means to be good people in the 21st century. And the messiness of it is going to make us harder, is going to make it harder. It's going to inform the way in which utilitarian moral theory develops out of the late 18th century and into the 19th century, and the way moral theory in general seems to develop. And ethical discourse in general seems to develop in the 19th and specifically by the 20th and now 21st century. And so that completes this big, complex intellectual journey, this kind of three-part journey that explored Kantian absolutism. And I hope that in some ironic way, you have a greater clarity about the messiness of our moral lives, and still, though, on a kind of an awareness of the import of our commitment to constructive ethical discourse. I wish you well.